The WNBA fining and suspending
WNBA star Caitlin Clark now speaking out.
Clark just did something only 4 other players in basketball history have ever done. 45 points, 10 assists, a defensive line that put her name next to legends. 24 hours later, she was one step closer to a suspension. That whiplash, from historic performance to disputed technical foul, did not happen by accident. It traces back to a borderline call in June the league upheld instead of rescinding, one fans have been documenting closely since. Was Saturday's technical really about a screen she never saw coming, or a pattern that has been building for months? Let's break down the evidence and find out exactly how it connects. From record books to referee whistles. The numbers from Friday night are worth stating plainly, because they are the kind of numbers that do not need embellishment. 45 points, 10 assists. A defensive line, blocks and steals combined.
Trying to get Clark the ball and they turn it over. Johnson with a steal. Johnson had it wrenched away.
That only a handful of players in the history of men's or women's professional basketball have ever matched in a single game. Caitlin Clark produced that stat line while still playing under a minutes restriction, and she did it in well under 30 minutes of court time. Analysts reach for comparisons to Michael Jordan. Other names, including Luka Doncic, entered the conversation. Social media, by most accounts, struggled to find adequate language for what had just happened. Is it possible to overstate a single night like that? Rarely. According to the kind of historical comparison analysts reach for only a handful of times in a career, only 4 other players in the entire history of men's or women's professional basketball had ever recorded a stat line as statistically rare as this one. For one evening, the entire basketball conversation revolved around what Clark had done on the floor, what it meant for the record books, and what it signaled about where her career was heading. That conversation lasted less than a full day. There is a detail underneath that performance worth isolating, because it sharpens the contrast with what followed. Clark produced that historic stat line while still playing under a minutes restriction imposed earlier in the season out of injury caution. A limitation that had shaped how her coaching staff managed her workload for months. A player operating under a reduced minutes plan does not typically produce a career-defining performance. The two things are, in most cases, in tension with each other. That she did it anyway raises an obvious question. If a restricted, cautious workload still produced one of the rarest stat lines in the sport's history, what does that suggest about her caliber under normal circumstances? The league did not have long to consider that question before a very different storyline took over. 90 seconds into Indiana's next game, against the New York Liberty,
good start for New York on the road, seeing it go through early.
Clark ran into a hard screen set by an opposing player and went to the ground. She looked for a foul call. It did not come. She stood up, exchanged a few words with the nearest official, and was given a technical foul before the game had barely started, her 6th of the season, and a $1,000 fine to go with it. What makes a non-call in the game's opening minutes significant enough to shape the entire narrative around it? Context. This was not simply a disputed whistle in isolation. It was a disputed whistle sitting on top of a season-long pattern that fans and media had already been tracking closely. The game itself, on its own terms, was a comfortable win. Indiana defeated a Liberty team that had beaten them earlier in the season by a final score of 108-88, with Kelsey Mitchell contributing 33 points.
Just another year of the team being together. Mitchell hits the 3.
For a team sitting at 15 wins and 10 losses, fighting for playoff positioning in an increasingly competitive conference, that result mattered. It barely registered in the coverage that followed. What registered instead was the technical, the fine, the math. 2 more technical fouls before a mandatory 1-game suspension. 6 down, 3 to go. That a team's best win in weeks could be overshadowed by a single disputed whistle says less about the win and more about how closely every one of Clark's technical fouls is now being tracked, tallied, and discussed as its own separate storyline. Was this weekend an isolated overreaction, Or does it fit a pattern that has been building since well before this specific game? The evidence, when traced back, points clearly toward the latter, and the story of how that pattern started begins several months earlier, in a much less discussed game. There is a broader pattern worth naming in how quickly the record book performance disappeared from the coverage cycle. A stat line matched by only a handful of players in the sport's history would, under ordinary circumstances, dominate headlines for days. Instead, by the following afternoon, the primary subject of conversation had already shifted entirely toward the fine and the suspension math. That speed of displacement is itself a data point. It suggests the technical foul story was not simply newsworthy on its own merits, but was slotting into a narrative framework that had already been building for months, one primed to treat every subsequent disciplinary decision as more significant than whatever came before it on the court. The technical that changed everything. To understand why a single non-call on a Saturday in the fall carried the weight it did, the timeline has to go back to June. In a game against the Phoenix Mercury, Clark committed a technical foul that many observers and commentators at the time.
Incident came just 2 days after another physical matchup between the Fever and Mercury, which featured several technical fouls and an ejection.
Described as borderline at best, the kind of physical, frustrated moment that officials typically let pass without a whistle, and that most players and fans forget within a week. This one did not disappear. After a formal review, the Wnba upheld the technical rather than rescinding it, even though similar calls involving other players had been reversed earlier in the same season. Why would a league uphold one player's technical while rescinding comparable calls for others in the same year? That is precisely the question that turned a routine officiating decision into a flashpoint. Not because a single technical foul is disastrous on its own, but because of what the decision seemed to reveal about how Clark's situation was being handled relative to everyone else on the floor. Decisions like that tend to set precedent whether or not the league intends them to. Once a technical is upheld on review rather than reversed, it becomes a reference point. The next disputed call involving the same player gets measured against it, and so does every subsequent explanation, or lack of explanation, the league offers. Did the league anticipate that a single upheld review would become the fixed point every later dispute gets compared against? Nothing in the public record suggests it did, but that is functionally what happened. Fans noticed almost immediately. Within hours of the ruling, screenshots were circulating, and side-by-side comparisons began appearing across social media timelines. Footage of other players behaving similarly or more aggressively without facing the same disciplinary outcome.
Honestly, it was a complete accident. No one even knew it happened. It's just unfortunate, but yeah, the league has to do better in this instance.
None of those players were drawing anywhere near the same level of scrutiny for actions that, on their face, looked at least as frustrated and at least as physical. That question, why does a call get rescinded for one player and upheld for another in the same season, did not go away. It became the lens through which every subsequent technical foul involving Clark was viewed. By the time her sixth technical arrived months later, fans were not simply reacting to one bad call. They were responding to a pattern they had been documenting since spring, box score by box score, screenshot by screenshot, compared against a trend many of them had grown convinced the league was either unable to recognize or unwilling to confront directly. Is it fair to describe that kind of season-long tracking as fan overreaction? The involvement of Indiana's own coaching staff suggests otherwise. Stephanie White, the Fever's head coach, does not operate a fan account and is not an anonymous commentator online. She is a professional coach who has to manage her roster and discuss officiating carefully, in a way that avoids creating further friction with the league office. Even so, following an earlier technical, she told reporters that the team needed conversations about being more strategic regarding how fouls were being called against her own player.
WNBA superstar who had 2 cheap shots right there that weren't called.
That detail is worth sitting with. A head coach, on the record, acknowledging that a player's relationship with league officiating had become something the organization needed to actively manage, not something they expected to fade on its own, and not something they were dismissing as internet noise, but something they were strategically planning around. When a team's own coaching staff chooses its words that carefully in public, it tends to indicate the underlying pattern is harder to dismiss than it might otherwise appear. National media outlets began paying attention as well, with some describing the dynamics surrounding Clark's treatment, using terms like a political tug-of-war. One week praised as the league's biggest draw, the next week discussed as a player facing unusually strict discipline. That whiplash in framing is itself part of the story. A single athlete being cast simultaneously as the league's greatest asset and its most disciplined liability, sometimes within the same 7-day stretch. Once that framing moved beyond Wnba-specific coverage and into general sports discourse, the league lost a measure of control over how the story was being told. And once casual fans who had never previously thought about technical foul procedure started asking questions about consistency and fairness, the pressure stopped being containable within any single fan community. Which sets up the next stage of this pattern: how organized that fan tracking effort actually became. When fans started keeping the score, once the officiating question left specialist coverage and entered mainstream sports conversation, an unusual thing happened. The documentation did not fade with the news cycle. It got more organized. A quick look at where Clark stands in the league's technical foul rankings.
A flagrant foul. The Phoenix Mercury's Alyssa Thomas appears to put her fist on Caitlin Clark's throat.
Makes the picture harder to dismiss as coincidence. She is currently tied for second in the league, trailing only one other player. Why does that ranking matter more than the raw number suggests? Because of who else occupies that same disciplinary bracket. The players near the top of that list are largely physical interior presences and high-contact two-way defenders. Players whose styles naturally generate more edge-of-the-whistle moments through constant physical engagement, hard drives, and defensive collisions. Clark's game is built around passing, shooting, and floor spacing. Not the kind of contact-heavy, emotionally charged play that typically produces a high technical foul count. A guard whose primary offensive value comes from distance shooting and playmaking simply does not generate the same volume of physical, whistle-adjacent contact that a bruising interior defender does over the course of a game. So why, by mid-season, are players with such different on-court profiles landing in the same disciplinary bracket? It is a harder coincidence to explain the longer it is examined, and it is exactly the kind of mismatch that invites closer scrutiny rather than less. When questions like that go unanswered by the league office, fans tend to fill the silence with their own conclusions. And in this case, the response has been unusually structured for something with no official framework behind it. During Fever games, fans now refresh box scores in real time, specifically to track whether a given call moves Clark closer to the suspension threshold. Screenshot threads compile footage and timestamps for disputed calls. Side-by-side comparisons continue to circulate, matching Clark's technical foul history against players whose on-court behavior is, by most neutral readings, comparable or rougher. This is not sporadic venting. It functions closer to an informal fact-checking operation, persistent, well-organized, and largely unwilling to let a disputed call pass without scrutiny. Could a league simply outlast that kind of attention by saying nothing at all? Silence has a shelf life of its own, and the length of that shelf life is exactly what the next stretch of this season is likely to test. There is an asymmetry worth naming here: the most detailed, consistently updated public record of Clark's disciplinary history.
As Team USA comes back the other way, looking to punish, Caitlin Clark pulls up from deep.
Has not come from the league office itself, which has offered little explanation for individual rulings, but from an unaffiliated group of fans compiling the record independently. That is not a typical dynamic for a professional league to find itself in. Most disciplinary patterns, when questioned, are eventually addressed through some combination of official statement, rule clarification, or media briefing. Here, the explanatory gap has instead been filled by the audience the league depends on for its own growth. What does it mean for a league office to have a public, crowdsourced record of nearly every disciplinary decision it makes, compiled and cross-referenced by an audience that is actively watching? Even without a formal petition, spokesperson, or coordinated campaign, that kind of sustained, documented attention becomes a form of pressure in its own right, one that does not fade after a single news cycle, but accumulates with every additional technical foul added to the record. That accumulation is precisely what separates this situation from an ordinary controversy that flares up and dissipates within a week. A single viral clip or a single bad beat headline typically loses momentum once the news cycle moves on. A running, cross-referenced record, updated after every game, compared against a growing archive of prior calls, does not lose momentum in the same way. It gets harder to dismiss the longer it exists, not easier, because each new entry reinforces the pattern rather than standing alone. That accumulation has a financial dimension as well, one that has received less attention than the officiating debate itself, but is arguably just as significant to understanding why this particular pattern has become impossible for the league to quietly manage. The rising cost of every technical foul. Before this season began, the Wnba quietly restructured its technical foul fine system.
Yet, it might have had a technical foul there just as this first half was expiring.
Under the new schedule, a player's 4th through 7th technical fouls each carry a $1,000 fine, a significant increase from the $200 starting point used in prior seasons. That change applied uniformly across the league, but uniform rules do not always produce uniform outcomes, and the financial cost of frustration has climbed sharply for a player sitting closer to the suspension threshold than almost anyone else in the league. Is $1,000 a meaningful sum for a professional athlete at this level? Probably not on its own, but the dollar figure is not really the point that matters here. What the fine structure reveals is a set of priorities. When the cost of a player's frustration rises, while the consistency of the calls generating that frustration stays the same, the burden of responsibility shifts almost entirely onto the player. In effect, the structure treats raising the cost of a reaction as a substitute for addressing the inconsistency that produces the reaction in the first place. Fans and commentators who see the officiating pattern as the root cause, rather than Clark's on-court conduct, have taken particular note of that framing.
Caitlin Clark owns the WNBA. Every night it is absurd highlight after absurd highlight.
Does raising the price of frustration ever actually fix inconsistency, or does it just make inconsistency more expensive to live with? The distinction matters, because only one of those outcomes addresses the underlying problem. That framing also raises a broader, league-wide question worth pausing on. A fine structure built around escalating financial penalties functions, in effect, as an incentive system. It is designed to discourage a specific behavior by making it progressively more costly. That logic only holds up if the behavior being discouraged is the actual source of the problem. If the underlying driver is instead a pattern of inconsistent officiating, then an escalating fine schedule does not fix anything structural. It simply makes the symptom more expensive for the player experiencing it most, without touching the cause. Applied uniformly across a league with hundreds of players, that kind of policy can look neutral on paper while still landing unevenly in practice, which is precisely what critics of the current structure argue is happening here. What happens mechanically if an 8th technical foul arrives?
Technical fouls this season. So what I did is I rewatched every game, not only the technical foul, but what led up to it.
Stripped of the surrounding drama, the rule itself is simple. A 9th technical foul in a regular season triggers an automatic 1-game suspension. No hearing, no appeal, no mechanism to reconsider the decision afterward. For most players on most teams in most seasons, that would be an inconvenience. For this Fever team, at this point in the schedule, it would be considerably more disruptive. Indiana sits at 15 wins and 10 losses, fighting for playoff position in a conference that has grown more competitive as the season has progressed. Clark's individual production underlines exactly why a missing night would matter so much. She is averaging close to 21 points, roughly 8 assists, and around 4 rebounds per game, numbers that make her more than simply Indiana's leading scorer. She is the organizing principle of the team's offense, the player whose ability to generate open looks for teammates reshapes opposing defensive strategy, and whose scoring range alone forces adjustments no other player on the roster can replicate. Removing her from the lineup does not just cost the Fever a scorer. It requires the team to run a meaningfully different offense, with essentially no notice. How does a roster rebuild its offensive identity on 48 hours' notice, without months of practice built around the new approach? In practical terms, it does not. Not cleanly, and not without cost. And the cost would not stop at Indiana's win column. Clark's presence has been tied directly to increases in broadcast viewership, attendance, and a level of national interest that women's basketball has historically struggled to sustain consistently. Arenas she plays in have been reliably selling out. The league itself has publicly credited her presence with accelerating growth beyond what any single marketing campaign could achieve on its own. A suspended night, in other words, would not just be a disciplinary footnote. It would cost the league one of its most dependable draws at a moment when casual interest in the sport is higher than it has been in years. Clark's call for change. Throughout this stretch, Clark has been notably careful about how she has characterized the situation. She has not presented this as a personal grievance. Instead, she has steered the conversation toward a structural argument. Replace the league's part-time officiating model with full-time referees. That distinction carries more weight than it might first appear. She is not asking the league to reverse rulings in her favor or requesting special treatment. She is arguing that consistent officiating would benefit every player, a staffing and infrastructure issue, not a personal one. The mechanism is worth spelling out. A part-time model means officials are not necessarily working WNBA games as their primary profession.
Massive number for the WNBA All-Star Game this past Saturday,
which can limit the preparation, film review, and consistency training available compared to a fully professionalized staff. Full-time officiating would treat the job as a dedicated career rather than a supplemental role, a change with implications far beyond any one player's technical foul count. Why does that framing matter more than the complaint itself? It changes the shape of the debate. Instead of asking whether Clark personally receives too many technicals, the question becomes whether the league's officiating system needs structural improvement, a harder claim to wave away without appearing to avoid a fixable problem. That puts league leadership in a genuine bind. Rejecting a staffing argument risks looking resistant to an obvious fix, while acting on it requires real resources and organizational change that cannot happen overnight. This is where the backfire becomes visible. Every attempt to manage this quietly, fines issued without comment, technicals upheld without explanation, has generated more documentation, not less. Fans have kept a running record since spring. National media coverage has crossed into general sports discourse and shows no sign of retreating. Indiana's own head coach has gone on record.
Here, Gasoline Alley Fever head coach Stephanie White joins me now. And Steph, you know the 500. What's this day like for you?
Carefully but unmistakably, acknowledging the pattern needs to be managed. That is pressure from 3 directions at once: player, media, and an organized fan base. And the league has yet to offer a response that resolves any of it. It is worth being precise about what this pattern does and does not establish. Fan-compiled comparisons document a disparity in how calls have been handled. They do not on their own prove deliberate intent. What the evidence does establish is that the disparity exists, documented consistently by multiple independent sources, without a public explanation that closes the question. Does the Wnba intend to respond directly, or keep managing this through fines and silence? If fines keep arriving without explanation, silence starts to function as policy. Harder to sustain the longer documentation accumulates. Whether an 8th or 9th technical arrives remains uncertain. What is not uncertain is that the disparity, the financial structure, and Clark's structural request will still be there regardless of that outcome, still requiring an answer the league has so far avoided giving. None of this started with a stat line or a screen. It started in June, with one upheld call fans refused to let disappear, and every fine since has added to the record they built. Clark has not complained. She has asked for a fix that helps every player, exactly why the league cannot quietly wave it away. Call this the moment silence stopped working as a strategy. Whether the response comes before an 8th technical or after a 9th, the documentation is not going anywhere. If this changed how you see the pattern behind Clark's fouls, leave a like, drop a comment with your read, and subscribe for the next investigation.